My husband's business partner has been stealing from me for 2 years, and my husband knew. He helped him do it. While I was sitting across from both of them at dinner every Sunday, pouring the wine, laughing at their jokes, 8 months pregnant with our daughter, breathe. Why would the man I built everything with want to destroy me? The attorney who reviewed my case that night heard everything, and what he did next changed the rest of my life. Before we get into this story, hit like, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop your location in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from right now? We want to know exactly where this story is reaching today. Thank you. Now let's dive in. She was one of the most quietly powerful women in American real estate, and someone was dismantling her empire from the inside. The man who had authorized it was her husband, and on the night she finally understood this, he was sitting in the den of their Connecticut home, glass of bourbon in hand, watching the markets close, waiting for her to sign a document she hadn't read carefully enough. Her name was Sylvia Hargrove Bellamy, 37 years old, founder of Hargrove Capital Partners, a private real estate investment firm she had started from a one-room office in downtown Hartford. With $40,000, a laptop, and a stubbornness that her mother had always called her worst quality, and her best one simultaneously. By the time she was 34, the firm managed a portfolio of commercial and residential assets across 11 states, valued at just under $900 million. The Wall Street Journal had profiled her twice. The second time, the headline read, "The Woman Who Doesn't Lose." She was 8 months pregnant when she lost everything, not all at once. That's what nobody tells you about financial ruin. It doesn't arrive like a flood. It arrives like a slow leak you keep meaning to check. A discrepancy in a quarterly report. A vendor payment that clears twice. A signature on a transfer authorization that looks almost exactly like hers, but isn't quite. It was her accountant, Frances Dumont, who first flagged it. Frances had worked for Hargrove Capital for 6 years, was the kind of woman who kept 3 backup copies of every spreadsheet and color-coded her file folders by fiscal quarter. She had called Sylvia on a Tuesday afternoon in March, with the particular careful flatness in her voice that meant something was wrong. "Sylvia, I need you to look at something before I send you the Q1 summary." The discrepancy, when Sylvia pulled it up, was small. $73,000 routed to a vendor account she didn't recognize, clean paperwork. Her signature on the authorization. She had not signed it. She sat with that fact for a long moment. Then she started pulling files. What she found, over the following 72 hours, sitting at the kitchen table while her husband, Owen Bellamy, moved around her making coffee, asking if she was sleeping enough, pressing his hand to her shoulder the way he always did, was this. Owen and his business partner, a man named Fletcher Cross, had been siphoning money from Hargrove Capital for 22 months. The method was elegant, if that word can be used for something so deliberately ugly. Fletcher, who had full accounting access as the firm's COO, a position Sylvia had created for him at Owen's strong recommendation 3 years ago, had established 7 shell vendor accounts across 4 states. Invoices were generated, approved, and paid. The authorizations all carried Sylvia's digital signature, replicated from a contract template Fletcher had retained from their first year working together. The payments averaged between $60,000 and $90,000 per cycle. 22 months, 4 to 6 cycles per month. When Sylvia finally reached the total, she sat very still for a long time. $11.4 million. She pressed both hands flat on the table. The baby kicked, hard, as though she knew. The document Owen had asked her to sign that evening, the one sitting on the kitchen counter beside a pen he'd already uncapped, was a prenuptial amendment she had never agreed to, drafted to look like a routine asset protection update. If she had signed it, she would have waived her right to pursue any claims against joint assets in the event of a business dispute. It would have made the theft nearly impossible to litigate. She didn't sign it. She called a lawyer instead. His name was Miles Ashby. He was 41, a former federal prosecutor who had spent the last 8 years running a white-collar criminal defense and litigation practice out of Boston. He was not Sylvia's regular attorney. Her regular attorney was the one who had recommended the vendor contracts that Fletcher had exploited. She had found Miles through a client referral at 11:30 at night, called him from the bathroom with the door locked and the shower running, and told him in a flat, careful voice exactly what she had found. There were 4 seconds of silence on his end. "Don't sign anything," he said. "Don't let him know you found it. Can you do that?" She looked at herself in the mirror. Her eyes were dry. Her jaw was set. "Yes," she said. "Good. I need everything you've pulled. Tonight if possible." "Already packaged," she said. Another pause, shorter this time. "Okay," Miles said, and she could hear something shift in his voice. Not pity. Something more useful than pity. "Then we're already ahead." What followed was 6 weeks of the most precise performance of her life. Sylvia continued going to the office. She smiled at Fletcher in meetings. She had dinner with Owen on Friday nights at the Italian place they'd been going to since their second date. She laughed at his stories. She let him put his hand on her back when they walked to the car. She slept beside him every night, and she did not cry until she was in the shower with the water running. And even then she kept it quiet, because she had spent 37 years learning to keep things quiet that needed to be dealt with rather than displayed. Miles worked in parallel. He had a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Boston, an agent named Tara Osei, who had made her reputation on exactly this kind of layered corporate fraud. They had worked 3 cases together. She reviewed the package Sylvia had compiled and called Miles the next morning. "This is clean," Tara said. "Where did she get all of this?" "She pulled it herself," Miles said. A pause. "She's still in the office with them?" "Every day. She's either very brave or very cold-blooded." "I think," Miles said, "she's both." The case built quickly. The shell accounts led to a holding company registered in Delaware that had then transferred funds to 2 accounts, one in Owen's name, one in Fletcher's, opened at a private bank in the Cayman Islands 18 months ago. The FBI found the account setup documents. They found the email chain, encrypted but not well enough, in which Fletcher had written, after Sylvia's second trimester scan had come back healthy. "She'll be distracted for at least a year after the baby. Plenty of time to close everything out and restructure before she even notices the gap." Owen's reply, sent 4 minutes later, agreed. "Make sure the Q3 numbers look clean. She always checks Q3. Tara called Miles when they found it. "We're ready to move," she said, "but we'll time it however she wants." Miles called Sylvia. "Name the day," he said. She was quiet for a moment. She was standing at the window of her home office, looking out at the backyard, at the oak tree Owen had promised 2 years ago he would get trimmed before winter. He had never gotten it trimmed. "The Hargrove Capital annual investor dinner," she said. 4 weeks from Thursday. The grand ballroom at the Whitmore. Every major investor, every board member, every person whose money Fletcher and Owen have been stealing from. I want them all in the room." Miles said nothing for a moment. "Sylvia, they have been stealing from my investors," she said very quietly. "Not just from me, from the people who trusted my name. They need to see this. They need to know I knew, and I handled it." Miles was quiet again. Then, 4 weeks from Thursday, 4 weeks from Thursday. She had her daughter 2 weeks before the dinner. 41 hours of labor, a delivery that pushed the limits of everything she thought she could survive. And then a small, furious, unbelievably perfect person placed on her chest, squinting at the light of the world with an expression of profound skepticism. Sylvia held her and wept. The good kind. The kind that comes from somewhere you didn't know you had. Owen stood at the bedside and played the role of devoted father with the same practiced ease he played every other role. He brought flowers, he took photographs. He posted one to his Instagram with the caption, "My whole heart, ×2. He held Claire against his chest for exactly the right amount of time and looked at Sylvia with exactly the right expression. She looked back at him and thought, 22 months. At our own dinner table. Every Sunday, you looked at me exactly like that." She said nothing. She was home from the hospital in 3 days. She had Clara on her chest and a laptop open beside her, and Miles on the phone every evening after Owen fell asleep, going over the final case details, the structure of what would happen at the Whitmore, where the agents would be positioned, how the documentation would be presented. "You should be sleeping," Miles said once, at close to midnight. "I'll sleep after," she said. A pause. "How's Clara?" She looked down at the baby, who had fallen asleep with one fist curled against her chin, the way she always did. She's perfect, Sylvia said. Good, Miles said. And then, after a moment, quieter. You're doing something extraordinary, Sylvia, I want you to know that. She didn't answer right away. I'm doing what needs doing, she said finally. But she didn't hang up quite as quickly as she usually did. The annual Hargrove Capital Investor Dinner had been a fixture on the New England financial calendar for 9 years. The Whitmore Hotel's Grand Ballroom, Boston, champagne on arrival, a 5-course dinner, brief remarks from Sylvia, an overview of portfolio performance, projections. 240 guests, board members, major investors, institutional partners, 3 state senators, the mayor of Hartford, reporters from 2 financial publications. Fletcher Cross arrived in a charcoal suit and spent the cocktail hour shaking hands with the ease of a man who had won something. Owen was at his side, relaxed, smiling, asking someone about their ski trip to Vail. At 8:47 in the evening, the doors at the far end of the grand ballroom opened. Sylvia Hargrove Bellamy walked in. She was wearing a dress the color of midnight, deep navy, structured, authoritative, and she was carrying Clara against her chest in a way that was neither apologetic nor performative, simply factual. This is my daughter, and she is here, and so am I. Clara was 6 weeks old and wearing white, and she was looking at the glittering chandelier above the ballroom with the expression of someone who had decided provisionally that the world was acceptable. The room went quiet in stages. First, the people nearest the door, then rippling outward as heads turned, as people saw her, until the entire ballroom, 240 people mid-sentence, mid-sip, mid-law, simply stopped. Sylvia walked forward. She did not rush. She had never rushed in her life, and she was not about to start now. She found Owen's face across the room. She watched the smile leave it. She watched him go the particular gray color of a man who has just understood something he cannot undo. Fletcher, standing beside him, followed Owen's gaze and made a sound, a sharp intake of breath that the 3 people nearest him would later mention, unprompted, in their statements to federal investigators. Sylvia reached the center of the room and stopped. She looked around at the investors, the board members, the senators, the reporters, the 238 people who had trusted her name and her judgment and whose money had been used to fund a Cayman Islands account in her husband's name. She smiled, the way she had always smiled at this dinner, warm, steady. Good evening, she said. Thank you all for being here. I have some things to share with you tonight that aren't in the program. Miles Ashby walked in through the side entrance. Behind him, through 4 simultaneous doors, came 16 FBI financial crimes agents in evening attire, suits, blazers, dresses, who had been positioned at tables throughout the room for the past 90 minutes, holding drinks they hadn't touched. Agent Tara Ossie stepped forward and addressed the room with the particular controlled clarity of someone who has done this before and knows exactly how much space the words need. Good evening. My name is Special Agent Tara Ossie, FBI Financial Crimes Unit, Boston Field Office. What I'm about to present is the formal summary of a 6-month federal investigation into the fraudulent diversion of funds from Hargrove Capital Partners, totaling $11.4 million, executed by Owen Bellamy and Fletcher Cross over a period of 22 months. Every screen in the grand ballroom, the presentation screen Sylvia's team had set up for the portfolio overview, lit up simultaneously, the shell company filings, the wire transfer records, the bank account documents from the Cayman Islands, the email chain, Fletcher's words, in his own font on his own server, on a screen 60 inches wide. She'll be distracted for at least a year after the baby. Plenty of time to close everything out, and Owen's reply, agreed. Make sure the Q3 numbers look clean. She always checks Q3. 240 people read those words in silence. This is Sylvia, whatever they've told you, whatever they've... Stop. Her voice was quiet, not raised. It didn't need to be. The room was perfectly silent, and she was perfectly still, and the word landed like something that had been waiting a long time to be said. Don't say my name like that, she said. Don't say it like we're in the middle of something you can still talk your way out of. She looked at him, the face she had looked at across tables and pillows in hospital rooms, the face that had told her, at their wedding, that she was the most extraordinary person he had ever known. You accessed my firm's systems with my CO, whom you recommended hiring, whom I trusted because you asked me to. You forged my signature. You stole $11 million from my investors over 22 months. You did it at our dining room table, at our dinners, at our Sunday mornings while I made you coffee. And 2 weeks before I gave birth to our daughter, you put a fraudulent document in front of me and handed me a pen." She paused. "Her name is Clara. She is 6 weeks old, and she will know exactly what you chose." Owen's composure, which had held for most of the evening with a kind of terrible professionalism, dissolved, not gradually. All at once, the way things that had been held too tightly finally give. He reached toward her. "Sylvia, The handcuffs went on before he could finish the sentence. Fletcher was arrested simultaneously by 2 agents who had been standing directly behind him for the last 4 minutes. The room remained completely still. Clara, against Sylvia's chest, opened her eyes, looked up, made a small, unimpressed sound, and went back to sleep. Someone in the back of the room began to clap. Slowly at first, then the room filled with it. Sylvia did not take a bow. She just stood there in the middle of the grand ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel and let it wash over her like something she had earned. The trial lasted 9 weeks. Owen's attorney argued duress, then manipulation by Fletcher, then painted a portrait of a woman so consumed by professional ambition that she had neglected her marriage to the point of emotional abandonment. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Owen Bellamy was convicted on 14 counts: wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, securities fraud, and 5 counts related to the endangerment of investor assets. The judge, a woman named the Honorable Constance Fitch, who had spent 26 years on the federal bench in Massachusetts and was known for sentencing that made lawyers sit down quietly and say nothing, read the verdict disposition without inflection. "Mr. Bellamy, this court finds that you participated in a sustained, calculated campaign to defraud both your wife and the investors who placed their trust in her name, executing your scheme over 22 months, including the period of her pregnancy, with full knowledge of the harm you were causing. You used her name, her signature, her professional reputation, and her personal trust in you as the instruments of your fraud." She paused. "You are sentenced to 19 years in federal prison with eligibility for parole review after 14. Owen sat very straight when the sentence was read. He had maintained his composure throughout the trial with the particular discipline of a man who still believed, at some fundamental level, that this would resolve differently. When the gavel came down, something in his face cracked open. Not grief, exactly. Something more like shock. The genuine, disoriented shock of someone who has never before been held fully accountable for anything. Fletcher Cross received 16 years. He had cooperated with investigators earlier in the process, which his attorney had argued warranted leniency. The judge noted his cooperation and sentenced him to 16 years anyway. He was escorted from the courtroom while still speaking. The divorce was finalized 8 weeks later. Sylvia walked out of the courthouse on a cold Friday morning in February, the Boston air thin and sharp and carrying the distant smell of the harbor. She stood on the steps and just breathed for a moment. "Sylvia." She turned. Miles was at the bottom of the steps, coat collar up against the wind, hands that particular stillness he had that she had come to recognize as his version of composure. Not blankness, but steadiness. The kind that cost something. "Finalized," he said. "Finalized." She exhaled. 11 minutes. I timed it. The corner of his mouth moved. 11 minutes. He signed it before his attorney finished reading it. She came down 2 steps. I think he thought it would help him in the appeal. "It won't. I know." They stood there for a moment in the February cold. Below them, the street was ordinary. Cabs, pedestrians, a delivery truck trying to parallel park. The world continuing at its regular speed. Miles reached into his coat pocket. The kind stationery shops sell for note cards, cream-colored, unsealed. "This is not a legal document," he said. "I want to be clear about that up front because I am constitutionally incapable of giving you anything without context." She looked at the envelope, then at him. He opened it. Inside was a photograph, printed on regular paper, slightly crooked because he had printed it himself. It showed Clara at her 6-week checkup, small and furious-faced, one fist raised. He had been in the waiting room that day, there for a document signature. And Sylvia had shown him the photo on her phone, and he had, without quite meaning to, said, "Can I have a copy of that?" and then been embarrassed by it for 3 weeks. On the back of the photograph, in his handwriting, "I would like to have dinner with you. Not a meeting, dinner. When Clara is ready for a babysitter and you are ready for a question you don't have to answer tonight." Sylvia read it twice. She looked up at him. His expression was the same as it always was, steady, careful, entirely legible if you knew how to read it, which she had learned to do over 6 months of late-night calls and early morning emails. And one Thursday afternoon, when Clara had been asleep in the carrier, and he had made them both coffee in his office kitchen, and they had talked for an hour about nothing related to the case. "You printed this yourself," she said. "The printer at the office doesn't center images correctly." "Miles, yes, the answer is yes," she said. "Not tonight." But yes, he looked at her for a moment. Then the smile came, the real one, not the careful professional version, the one that reached his eyes and stayed there. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay." They had their first dinner 4 months later, at a small Italian place in Cambridge that had no Yelp listing and required a reservation 3 weeks out. Clara came because the babysitter canceled, and Miles had said simply, "Bring her," and had then spent most of the dinner holding her with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who was not performing competence, but actually had it. Clara fell asleep on his shoulder before the pasta course. The waiter smiled. Miles didn't move for the rest of the meal. They married the following autumn, a small ceremony at a house on the Maine coast that Miles's family had owned for 30 years. White clapboard, blue shutters, the Atlantic just visible from the garden, 22 guests, a minister who was also a family friend. Sylvia wore a dress the color of sea glass and carried a small bouquet of wildflowers Clara had picked that morning, determinedly and imprecisely, from the garden. During his vows, Miles said, "I have been an attorney for 16 years, and I have spent most of those years in rooms where the truth was complicated and people had reasons for everything they did. I want to spend the rest of my life in a room where the truth is simple. And the truth is this: you are the most precise, relentless, gentle, impossible person I have ever known. And I am not letting go." Sylvia looked at him and said, "You found me at the worst moment of my life, and you never once made me feel like a case. You made me feel like a person worth fighting for. I didn't know how much I had forgotten what that felt like until you reminded me. So, yes, all of it, always. Yes." Miles cupped her face in both hands, the way he always did when he was about to say something he meant completely, and he kissed her in the pale autumn light while the Atlantic moved behind them, and the wildflowers trembled in the wind. Clara, sitting in the front row on the lap of Miles's mother, watched the whole thing with her characteristic expression of careful evaluation. Then she said, with the authority of a 2-year-old who has decided something definitive, "Mama, Miles," as though that settled the matter. Miles pulled back and looked at her over Sylvia's shoulders, and his face did something complicated and entirely transparent. "Yeah," he said softly. "That's right, Bug. In a federal correctional facility in New Hampshire, Owen Bellamy received a letter every year on Clara's birthday. Not from Sylvia. She had nothing left to say to him. The letters came from Hargrove Capital Partners' legal team. A single-page summary of the firm's annual performance, Clara's school enrollment update, and one photograph. The first one showed Clara at her first birthday, cake everywhere, laughing. The second showed her at 2, sitting on Miles' shoulders at the Maine coast, arms out like wings. The third showed her at 3, in the garden of the house Sylvia and Miles had bought in Brookline. Examining something in the dirt with a magnifying glass Miles had given her, and the expression of someone running a very serious investigation. Owen held that photograph for a long time. He had asked his attorney, once, whether there were grounds to contest the custody arrangement. His attorney had looked at him for a moment. "No," she said simply, and moved on to the next item. The photograph went face down on the desk in his cell. Owen sat with the silence he had made, in the room he had built for himself, and there was nothing in it but time. Sylvia rebuilt. The firm crossed $1.2 billion in managed assets 18 months after the trial. She launched an investor protection initiative that lobbied for stronger authentication requirements on fund authorization documents, and was later cited in 2 pieces of federal financial regulation. She gave a commencement address at her alma mater, UConn, not Harvard, the school she had actually attended, and said the thing her father had told her at 9 years old when she had lost a chess match she should have won and couldn't stop replaying the moves. You are not the worst thing that happened to you. You are every decision you made after. On Tuesday evenings, she came home. The Brookline house was 3 stories, slightly too much yard, a kitchen that got the afternoon light. Miles was usually home first on Tuesdays. She would find him at the counter with Clara, helping with whatever project had consumed her that week. A baking experiment, a bridge built from popsicle sticks, a drawing of every dog she had seen that month. The noise level was unreasonable. The kitchen was never completely clean. Sylvia would stand in the doorway for a moment before they heard her come in, just watching. The storm always passes, her father had told her. And the woman who waited? She is still standing. She is standing in the doorway of a Too Loud kitchen in Brookline on a Tuesday evening in November, watching her daughter explain something very important to the man who chose them both. And she is so alive, it is almost unbearable. She is still standing.